In the icy, frozen depths of Umbrella's underground laboratory, time stands still, but not by accident. The facility was deliberately frozen, a desperate containment measure to halt the spread of something far worse than death. Within its frigid halls lie horrifying secrets, locked away in ice, waiting for an unfortunate soul to set them free. The below-freezing point scenario in Resident Evil Outbreak is more than just a desperate fight for survival. It's a chilling glimpse into the chaos before Raccoon City's final collapse. As the survivors navigate the frozen labyrinth, their struggle to escape inadvertently aids the characters of Resident Evil 2. Their actions, such as defrosting critical systems, become unsung catalysts that help Leon and Claire in their escape from the facility. In the words of Edmund Burke, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Burke's words perfectly encapsulate the failures that led to this moment. The researchers who once worked in the facility saw the horror Umbrella was creating. But rather than fight back, they chose silence. Some believed that freezing the lab would be enough to contain the outbreak, while others simply feared the consequences of standing against Umbrella, whether it be death or becoming an unwilling experiment. In the end, their inaction didn't stop the nightmare, it only delayed it. But was thawing the facility truly a necessary step toward survival, or did it unleash an even greater nightmare? The line between salvation and catastrophe has never been thinner. But there's one more thing to consider: the continuity issues introduced by Resident Evil 2 Remake. While Outbreak takes place before Resident Evil 2, both games share a common setting in the same underground lab. However, Outbreak expands on the original layout, with Resident Evil 2 serving as a base design. In Outbreak, we get new areas that weren't seen in Resident Evil 2, while some older locations are kept, though certain areas are blocked off for plot purposes. On the surface, this doesn't pose a significant continuity issue between the two games, as the Outbreak Lab is essentially an expansion on the Resident Evil 2 design. As Nest is a reimagination of the Resident Evil 2 lab, it introduces an extra layer of confusion when we try to line up the events across Outbreak and Resident Evil 2. While the Outbreak series exists before the events of Resident Evil 2, it can't account for the existence of Nest due to being released years into the past. This leaves us to wonder how this new version of the Umbrella Lab fits into the bigger picture of the Outbreak timeline and the overall Resident Evil lore. Keep watching, because what we're about to uncover will change everything you thought you knew about the Outbreak, and might just leave you questioning how far-reaching our choices really are. So, how does all this tie together? How did the survivors of Below Freezing Point, trying to escape a derelict Umbrella Lab, set the stage for the nightmare that follows? Let's uncover how these interconnected events and the shifting timeline create new layers of horror. The decisions made under the freezing pressure of survival will ultimately lead to the destruction of Raccoon City as we know it. In the cold, desolate halls of Umbrella's underground laboratory, Yoko Suzuki is one of the few survivors left. Her backstory is a tragic one: a woman caught in a web of betrayal, survival, and an unwilling involvement in Umbrella's horrific experiments. Once as a researcher at the facility, Yoko's life was upended when the outbreak began. She wasn't an accomplice in Umbrella's twisted operations. She was someone who walked away after being a witness to the horror. But as the outbreak spread, Yoko's knowledge of the lab became crucial to her survival. She was familiar with the layout, the hidden research areas, and the experiments being conducted by Umbrella. What makes her story so tragic is that she couldn't escape her forced involvement. Despite initially attempting to distance herself from the unethical research, Yoko became trapped in the system, a witness to the grotesque outcomes of Umbrella's relentless pursuit of power. Yoko's connection with Monica, a former colleague, reveals even darker layers of her story. Monica reveals her true intentions when she kills a worker for the sample and holds Yoko at gunpoint to take her ID card to escape with the sample for her own dark goals. Monica knew all too well what was at stake, having seen the consequences of Umbrella's experiments firsthand. Her downfall, her theft, and her betrayal are a chilling reflection of the system that shaped her. Yoko, too, is forced to confront her own complicity in Umbrella's machinations as she navigates the frozen labyrinth of the lab. As the reality of the situation sets in, Yoko must grapple with the question of whether she can escape the horrors she helped unleash, or if she, too, will become yet another victim of Umbrella's greed and ambition. Yoko's journey is more than just a fight for survival. It's a reckoning with the choices she made, the system she was caught in, and the painful realization that, in a world where survival is everything, the line between good and evil can easily blur beyond recognition. In her desperate bid to escape with the sample, Monica becomes a victim of the very thing she sought to steal. The sample, a G virus mutation, manages to break free from its confinement in the attaché case Monica was carrying. It enters her body and begins to rapidly mutate within her, ultimately leading to her violent death. This monster bursts from her chest in a grotesque display, signaling the tragic culmination of her survival attempts. Monica's fate mirrors those of other unfortunate victims of the G virus, such as Ben Bertolucci and Chief Brian Irons, whose bodies also proved incompatible with the virus. In Resident Evil 2, it's explained that the G virus developed by William Birkin rejects hosts whose DNA does not align with its intended genetic structure. Sherry Birkin, for example, was the perfect match, which is why she didn't have the same fate as many others during William Birkin's rampage. However, for individuals like Monica, who were not genetically compatible, the virus causes grotesque and deadly mutations instead of its intended results. This tragic failure is underscored by the fact that Monica's desperation to survive and secure the G virus ultimately turned her into an unwilling host, a failed one at that. Her painful end serves as a grim reminder of the catastrophic consequences of Umbrella's experiments. Monica's initial betrayal of Yoko and her attempt to steal the sample set her on a path to becoming the catalyst of further disaster. In the end, she is not only a victim of the G virus, but a tragic symbol of the uncontrollable horrors unleashed by Umbrella's unchecked thirst for power. As Monica succumbs to her fate, the survivors are left to face the monstrous G-type, the fully grown version of the G larvae. This grotesque mutation of the G virus is more than just a boss fight. It's a battle not only for survival, but against the very nature of the virus itself. It serves as a reminder of how the virus can warp and twist human bodies beyond recognition, turning even the most desperate survivors into horrifying, uncontrollable creatures. In a twist of fate, the final battle takes place in the marshalling yard, which fans of Resident Evil 2 will recognize as a key location. Below Freezing Point is not merely a survival story. It's a pivotal chapter in the Resident Evil narrative, intricately woven into the chaos of Raccoon City's tragic fate. The survivors of the scenario, despite their best efforts, could not undo the inevitable disaster that would come to define the series. Their actions set in motion events that would eventually assist Leon and Claire in escaping the horrors of Raccoon City. In a cruel twist, what seemed like a desperate fight for survival played in the hands of a much darker, far more dangerous game. However, the true horror of Below Freezing Point lies in its underlying commentary on the consequences of human choices made in desperation. The survivors, in their attempt to escape from the frozen hell of Umbrella's laboratory, inadvertently become complicit in the collapse of Raccoon City. Their seemingly small decisions, made in the heat of the moment, have far-reaching consequences that ripple across the outbreak and alter the course of the city's downfall. For example, their actions did, in fact, reduce the number of zombies in the streets, creating a safer path for Jill, Leon, and Claire later on. They also played an unintended role in shaping the horrors to come. In the words of Albert Camus, "In the depth of winter, I finally learned within me there lay an invincible summer." This quote perfectly encapsulates the human drive to survive, even in the face of overwhelming darkness. The survivors of Below Freezing Point demonstrate this fundamental struggle, a desperate fight for life amidst an unforgiving world. As you reflect on this scenario, ask yourself, what if the choices you make in the heat of the moment have consequences far beyond what you ever intended? In a world as chaotic as Raccoon City, can we truly escape terror? So, when your moment arrives, what will you do? Will you consider the consequences, or will you act in the name of survival?